I wanted to welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Welcome to SRM 360's first live discussion, where we're aiming to help people make sense of the science, the politics, and the broader issues around solar geoengineering, also known as sunlight reflection methods, solar radiation modification, and various other names. I think you know SRM 360 is a new non-profit knowledge hub. Our goal is to support evidence-based discussions about the topic through articles, graphics, videos, podcasts, and content. We have no position on whether SRM should or shouldn't be used. We're just very keen that there be informed discussions around this, and we try to help that however we can. So the session today, there's a lot to get through. We're going to split this into two parts. The first part is going to be focused on the flurry of calls in the US for bans, moratoria on solar geoengineering, and then we'll move into the second half of the session where we'll be talking about the broader international context. Each half will have Pete asking our panelists a number of questions, and then we'll dive into 10 or 15 minutes or so of audience questions, which will take it one in the first half and one in the second. Please, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box. There's like a little question mark inside a quote box. Please type in any questions you have as you go along. We'll then basically read out a selection of those questions at the audience questions part. We'll try and get through as much as we can. Obviously, we won't be able to get through everything. So please also feel free to follow up after the session, and we'll be delighted to help as we can. Also, please, if you could identify your name and organization when you ask a question in that would be absolutely fantastic. We're going to get through this meeting in 1 hour, but we'll have a little bit of flexibility at the end, maybe 10 extra 15 minutes, something like that, in case there's anything else. After the end of the session, or at the end of the session, we'll invite you to fill in a quick poll. When the session ends, you'll also see a feedback form, but we'll also be sending follow-up emails with a survey and links to recording of the event. So without further ado, oh, by the way, I'm Mark. I'm the External Relations Director of SRM 360, and I'll hand over to our Editorial Director, Pete Irvin. Pete, over to you.
Hi there. So Mark's already introduced me, but let's just clarify, what is solar geoengineering? So this describes a set of approaches for reflecting sunlight with the aim of lowering global temperatures. Scientists are exploring whether these ideas might help if used alongside emissions cuts to help reduce the risk of climate change. Though there's a lot of concerns around these ideas that they could prove dangerous or disruptive, but it is something that's being considered by scientists and discussed internationally. It's also important to explain what it isn't. Solar geoengineering is not happening today. Besides a handful of very small-scale field experiments, this is an idea that remains in the lab and in climate models for the most part. However, it is increasingly entering the political realm, turning up in state legislatures in the USA, in recommendations to the European Commission, and on the agendas of intergovernmental organizations. And today we'll be focusing on the calls to ban or impose a moratorium on solar geoengineering that have been turning up in these various fora. And we are joined by 4 experts. Would you mind each introducing yourselves? I'll start with Craig, Joe, Josh, Julie, in that order if possible.
Hi, glad to be here. Craig Siegel. I'm an independent policy consultant. I formerly was the Deputy Executive Officer of the California Air Resources Board.
Hi, I'm Joe Sonka. I'm a state government reporter for Kentucky Public Radio. I've been here for 2 years, and I've covered Kentucky state government politics and policy for nearly 2 decades now.
Hi, I am Josh Horton. If you can see me, I am a senior program fellow working on solar geoengineering at the Harvard Kennedy School. I've been at Harvard for about 10 years working on various aspects of governance and politics and international relations related to solar geoengineering, or SRM.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie Vinders. I'm a senior research analyst at Trilateral Research. It's an SME based in the UK and Ireland. I have a background in international and EU environmental law, and I'm currently doing a legal analysis of SRM as part of the Co-Create project, which is an EU-funded project looking at the conditions for responsible research on SRM.
Fabulous. Well, thanks for joining us. Carrie, could you bring those slides up? So for a bit of context and motivation for why we're talking about this now, I just want to show a little analysis we've done recently. If you could skip forward a couple, there we are. So this is a graph showing the number of proposed solar geoengineering bans in US states over time. And you can see first couple started in 2023, things picked up a little in 2024, and this was something I hadn't paid close attention to until we started putting these numbers together and saw that it really took off in 2025. We're now up to, I think if my American geography serves me, half of all US states are considering bans on this topic. So if you could go to the next one and get a picture of where those are. So you can see here, the light pink colors are states that have proposals, either in the House or the Senate, to have a ban on this stuff. In the darker shade of red, the middling shade of red, these are places that have passed in one or the other, the House or the Senate. And you can see Tennessee is the only state that's actually passed one of these into law. The purples indicate places where something was proposed and then it failed when it was voted upon. So you can see there's a lot of movement going on in this space. So now let's turn to Craig. So Craig, what are these pieces of legislation about? What are they proposing to ban?
So this is a fascinating moment. I should say, I just checked yesterday, and I found 32 states, actually, that have some form of this introduced either this year or early last, although 11 of the bills have died thus far. So still a huge number, and an even larger trend than just noted since March. And these bills range in tone. Many of them clearly have been written by a shared activist community, and many have been amended. But at core, what they're doing is banning, in some cases criminalizing, outdoor release of certain kinds of materials that could affect solar reflectivity. But there's a big range here. Some of these statutes would literally ban release of any air contaminant into the air. So actually much more sweeping than any air pollution law than I've ever seen, since they're sort of misdrafted. Others would only ban the government from acting, which is odd, considering that there are more concerns about rogue actors than government actors, since the government's not doing this. And some are more narrowly focused indeed and just bar outdoor release of materials that would affect solar reflectivity, although, to be honest with you, with the intent of modifying the sun. So big range, some criminal, some civil, some really expansive, some not, some addressing things like cloud seeding, some not. So I guess what I'd say, just to close, is really broad swath of legislation, generally aimed at outdoor release of materials, very often drafted poorly or strangely. And the last thing I must observe as a longtime environmentalist, before going back to you, Pete, is I have helped to find striking that we're seeing efforts to ban a practice that largely isn't occurring, and in most small quantities wouldn't be a major public health threat at the same time in the US, as we're seeing massive efforts to roll back air pollution laws that in fact would harm the public. So it's a really odd, interesting moment in air pollution and environmental law.
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak to, because we're talking about solar geoengineering here, which is this global idea that's being considered. But there are other atmospheric interventions. People have thought about controlling the weather at various times in history. People have seed clouds. Are these different strands coming together here? How do you see this?
They are, and they're coming together in odd ways. So there are existing laws on environmental weather modification at the federal level. Most of these statutes don't really relate to them. And because they've been drafted so curiously, they tend to touch a lot of these other strands. Some of them would ban cloud seeding, which is probably bad news for farmers. Others address release of substances for weather modification generally, so not just solar geoengineering. So one thing I'd say, and this isn't that uncommon when an issue sort of first breaches into politics, is a lot of the drafting is sort of a poor match for the puzzle. And I think hopefully part of what this discussion can get at is what target should states perhaps be trying to hit, and then what target are they actually hitting? And those are quite different things based on my read of these statutes, or bills rather.
Speaking of targets, I mean, I presume the intent is to avoid harms to people. What impact might this have on the science of solar geoengineering?
Well, that's what I really worry about here. And there's a really appropriately broad range of thinking on whether one should ever address solar geoengineering in practice. But what is really clear, at least in my view, is that one would want to deeply understand how it could work. Now, these bills on the whole don't criminalize, say, computer modeling research or lab research, as far as I can tell. But they are introducing the specter of criminal law into research, and they're certainly criminalizing any form of outdoor research, which is, frankly, something people really ought to be able to properly do responsibly eventually, I think, to understand this practice. So in terms of public harm, what I think is likely to occur if these pass is we see something of a slowdown in efforts to test out how these practices, how these technologies might work in practice at a small, carefully monitored scale in a lot of these states. And of course, there's the concern, given that already RFK Jr. is retweeting these bills, this could spread federally, and then you could see sort of lurching federal policy at a time when actually one should be figuring out how to detect these activities and should be figuring out exactly what they could do. So we're sort of pre-blinding researchers, and that does worry me. I understand the desire to prevent, say, rogue actors from deploying with no half-cocked. That's a good public purpose. But the bills aren't written that way. They're written in ways that would actually really slow down research should people be attempting outdoor research.
You said there was a lot of similarities between these bills. Are they coming from a particular group? Is this driven from somewhere?
They appear to be. So there's a coalition, zerogeoengineering.com, which is closely linked to the anti-vax community and the anti-microwave sort of cell phone community, sort of the larger complex of folks around RFK Jr. And it's pretty clear based on these announcements on the website, these are largely flowing from them to largely, almost entirely, quite far-right legislators associated with the same sort of folks who've also raised concerns, say, about the measles vaccine, which may be why they have such an odd valence. So, but they really are coming from one particular ideological sector and one particular set of folks who already have a somewhat fraught relationship with mainstream science.
Well, I'm going to move over now to Joe for looking at a specific case, because you've been covering things in Kentucky. How did that unfold there?
Yeah, this was actually the third straight year where we've had at least one bill seeking to ban what they call geoengineering. There were identical bills filed in the Senate and the House this year, but unlike Tennessee last year, which passed it into law the first day to do so, the bills did not move at all. They did not receive even a committee hearing, and our session ended at the end of March. So there won't be anything until January 2026 when the legislature comes back for the next session. Now, why did it not advance? You could say it was because, well, Kentucky has a short session of only 30 legislative days instead of 60 legislative days in odd numbers years, so it's a narrower focus. But talking to the sponsor of the House bill, he said it might have something to do with the outcome of the last presidential election, where he was convinced that if there was a hypothetical President Kamala Harris, then there would have been a big push to expand geoengineering and expand research or implementation of it, and Kentucky would be in danger. Whereas he is confident that the Trump administration, particularly with RFK Jr., as you mentioned before, in the cabinet, that they're more comfortable that they're going to implement some kind of ban or moratorium, and Kentucky wouldn't have to do those. I'm sure he would still like to pass the bill, but he said it was less of an urgent matter than it would have been if Harris was elected.
And so what are the concerns motivating this? I mean, we've talked about geoengineering and weather control. We haven't mentioned the word chemtrail, but is that part of what's happening here? Is this a kind of coming from a conspiratorial realm?
Yeah, Kentucky provides an interesting case study because I talked to both the House sponsor and the Senate sponsor about their bills, and also checked their social media posts, which is maybe a little more enlightening. But when I talked to them over the phone, they both said, well, this is environmental concerns. We don't want harmful pollutants like aluminum sprayed into the air. Then they're going to come down and they're going to pollute Kentucky's air, Kentucky's water, Kentucky's soil. So they say that it's unnatural and we shouldn't do that. But these are both Republican members of the House and the Senate, and for many years their party has been in lockstep in opposition to any kind of federal, state, local environmental regulations on many different levels, but especially the coal industry, which has historically had such power and influence in Kentucky. And these are two legislators who are always voting for bills to restrict environmental regulations on coal. So it's a very interesting dynamic that we have here. But I think if you look at their social media polls, how they interact with supporters online, it's a window into maybe some additional motivations. Representative or Senator Steve Rawlings, he was in the House last year when he filed it. He's now was elected to the Senate this year. And late last year, someone on his Facebook page said, "Hey, are you going to refile that chemtrails bill?" And his answer to that wasn't, well, chemtrails isn't a real thing. This is geoengineering. He just said, "Oh, yeah, it's on the agenda." And that's how a lot of the supporters of both sponsors will refer to it as. They say, "Oh, yeah, I saw the chemtrails in the sky like every day, and I'm glad you're taking advantage of it, glad you're addressing this." Now, to the credit of the House sponsor, John Hodgson, he was he's been in aircraft engineering for 3 decades, and he very politely, every time someone talks about chemtrails on his Facebook page, he says, "Well, actually, if you look up FlightAware and find out the plane that you're talking about that's doing this, I'm sure you're going to see it's a commercial airline, and commercial airliners aren't doing this. I've never seen that before." But Rawlings, the senator, is quite different. Last year, he was on a podcast where the hosts were openly talking about chemtrails, and he was saying, "Yeah, I see this too. They've been doing this for years." And he's like, "Well, but I don't use that word chemtrails because that's like for some reason like that people feel that our issue is discredited when they use that." When I talked to him this year, he said that, well, if this bill gets a committee hearing, you're not going to see anyone testifying who uses that word because that discredits us. But if you look at the larger arguments that they're making, it's very similar to that. They're just not using those words in terms of whether this is some hypothetical research that could happen in the future or whether this is something that is actively happening and the government is trying to suppress. But the legislation in Kentucky goes far beyond geoengineering. It also deals with weather modification and cloud seeding. And that's where the House member, Hodgson, who was skeptical of or informing people that chemtrails isn't a real thing, chemtrails are cloud seeding has existed for 80 years or so. Some Western states do it, some countries do it. But if you look at his social media, he's retweeting and sharing things saying that cloud seeding and weather modification is, implying that it's the cause of flooding, implying that, the government can control the weather and hurricanes and natural disasters. He's retweeting like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has said that very openly. So it's kind of conflating the whole issue.
Yeah. I'm just going to jump in because so I guess in Captain America more than other countries, people's concerns drive legislation, but money also has a role to play in the politics of this. I do have a sense in which this is just purely from concerns of the individuals involved, or is there some rich individuals who've been pushing this as well?
Well, I would have been very interested to see if this actually got a committee hearing, who was there, who would be there to testify for it. I noticed that there were some electric utility companies that said that in their filing forms that they were lobbying on this bill. I'm assuming that they were lobbying against the bill or to amend the bill at least because they were feared that the language was so broad in it that it was going to ban like burning coal or something like that. So I didn't really notice any heavy lobbying by any wealthy force that was pushing these bills, and they didn't end up advancing.
Great. Well, I think now we'll move on to questions on this. Carrie, have you got some lined up?
We do. So from Xavier Landis, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, are those US bill drafts evenly introduced by both sides of the political spectrum, or are they heavily coming from a given party, Republicans or Democrats? So Joe or Craig, would you like to pick that
Happy to
up?
quickly take that, Carrie. Yeah, as we've sort of mapped out here, these are overwhelmingly Republican bills, and also Republican bills from a particular section of the party. And as we know, the modern GOP is currently increasingly torn between sort of conspiracists and sort of more center-right folks, and these are much more on the conspiracist side. So we're seeing these largely from the same sort of Republican members, sort of as Joe was talking about, who've been involved in other sort of quite far-right politics. And as I think someone else has noted, the same sort of folks who, generally speaking, are engaged in chemtrail and anti-vax discussions. So that's the center of gravity for this at the moment.
I would say in Kentucky too, that trend was too. If you look at the past years, the people who join on as co-sponsors, it's kind of the small government liberty people who are most upset about regulations and vaccinations when COVID happened.
Thank you both. And then we have a question from Marco Silva. After RFK Jr.'s tweet showing support for these legal challenges, is there any indication that the White House might officially back them? If so, in what way? Either of you want to jump in?
Sure. And I just want to make sure Josh and Julie get in when they'd like. But on this, I have seen nothing formal. So what folks should know is in the last administration, a petition was filed to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Air Administration, Atmospheric Administration, asking NOAA to update long delayed sort of weather modification detection regimes. There's been no action on that petition. That is still before the federal government formally. I've seen no legislation of this sort, though. So I think one of the really important questions here is that there are different strands of the current administration. There may be folks aligned with the sort of chemtrail stuff, RFK Jr. There may be others who are of a different mind on this and more interested in making sure research just continues, especially given global geopolitics. The US might want to better understand this. So far, that has meant stasis federally in this administration, which perhaps is a good thing considering the state of discussion.
Thanks, Craig. And then we have another question. Oh, lots of questions popping up. Thank you so much. Please do get involved. From Matthias Honegger, given the trend of anti-science sentiments in the current US politics, how do you view the role of academics towards trusted information?
Josh or Julie, as academics, do you have a view?
Josh, you want to jump in?
I can say a few words. It's not going to be anything deeper and insightful, but I think academics have a responsibility to try to, convey information that's accurate, that's comprehensive, that's balanced. I think, what you see today in the US and elsewhere with these sort of anti-science trends makes that very challenging. I'm not sure it's really incumbent upon scientists themselves to solve that. All that they can do is try to speak clearly, to speak in the first place, and to speak respectfully to all those in the audience, maybe some of whom question some of what we would call mainstream science, but keep speaking in ways that are civil and accurate and comprehensive and informative. I'm not sure what else we can do beyond that.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think your point on taking the concerns behind these moves seriously is an important one, because people's health have been harmed enormously by environmental pollution, air pollution, and the like, by new products and chemicals introduced into the environment. And so there are good reasons to be fearful, but there are good reasons to be fearful about the right things and some things that's worth not worrying so much about.
Thank you both so much. We have an anonymous question. What connections, if any, made between SRM and climate change by these groups pushing this legislation? And they note that it's interesting that constituencies who are perhaps more climate skeptic are taking SRM seriously. Would anyone have any comments to that?
Just a brief observation. I do think that's interesting. I've seen the same things I think Joe mentioned, where people astonishingly attribute the real symptoms of fossil-driven climate change, flooding, extreme weather, to chemtrails, and then get worried about this. So I think part of what we're seeing are the sort of polarized information environments a lot of people live in, where you're seeing people react actually with appropriate concern to extreme weather and changes in the atmosphere, attribute it to the wrong cause, and then on the basis of sort of their politics and communities, attempt to ban the wrong thing, in my view. So I guess what I find really striking here is we actually do have obviously a genuine atmospheric crisis. It's just not this. And one of the questions I think for everyone engaged in this discussion is how to help people understand where the problems are, what does need to be better understood, and what is not a problem, lest these solutions wind up sort of careening toward the wrong target.
Maybe I'll jump in. I remember I saw a podcast, on the slightly conspiratorial side of things, that laid out this vision for what was happening. The climate was changing, but it wasn't because of fossil fuels. It's because of people directly intervening in the system. And the reason they were doing that was to force the social changes that are needed that they're advocated for dealing with climate change, the real ones. So it was it had it inverted. Yeah, so it's interesting. I guess it's the realization of climate change is coming into the field, but in a slightly distorted way. Well, if we've got any more, maybe we can have one more question.
Just a couple more coming in. From Richard DeValen. What should the global research community do in light of the self-immolative conspiracy theories consuming American politics? How does the rest of the world soberly look at what is to be done? Big question there, Richard. Who wants to take that?
Maybe I'll pass that on to Julia, someone based in not America.
Yeah, it's a very, very important, very interesting, difficult question to answer, I think. What you see is, as well as it just plays into sort of more generally international geopolitics at the moment and US participation in international environmental agreements, for example. So what is to be done? I think what the best we can do is to have the open, informed debate about the best that we can, and take those concerns and around those conspiracy theories seriously, and to actively engage with the motives that are sort of underlying this, but because I don't think we can really have an informed debate and find sort of common ground without taking those underlying concerns seriously and where those are coming from. So yeah, to have as much of an open dialogue with all parties involved, and to understand where different people, different stakeholders are essentially coming from, to have a more informed debate.
We should have one last question and then move on to the international arena.
Okay, the last question on this section comes from Herb Simmons. Are there any groups in the USA that have organized to testify against these bills and in support of outdoor testing? If so, who are these groups? And if not, should there be?
Let me weigh in on that. I have not seen an organized effort in opposition yet, and I do think there should be. Here's my diagnosis. Perhaps this sets up the international conversation well. This is a debate without a center. As yet in the US, and I think internationally, I've seen quite far left groups assert that there should be sort of no experimentation at all, and the theory that if one understood these technologies, somehow climate mitigation would stop, which I do not think is plausible. And we have quite far right groups now, very actively organized into the US's current benighted politics, also attempting to stop research. To me, there's a very clear opportunity for the center, which is to say the environmental community, yes, but the business community, the security community, to say we should understand this better, and there are responsible ways to monitor this. Should we perhaps ban fly-by-night startups, the making sense of the world? I'd be game. Should we perhaps insist on better detection? Sure, but we need a more serious conversation. So gratuitous thanks to SRM 360 for ensuring we have one, but it speaks to a political need as well, I think, given what we're seeing happen to the politics.
And if I could say one word here, when I did my story on the geoengineering bills in Kentucky, I was reaching out to Kentucky university scientists and researchers, and no one really wanted to talk on the record. And I would say part of that is the kind of current context that we're in, the chilling of academic freedom and speech and fearing retaliation. I don't know if that played a role, but I know that locally I tried to reach out to Josh on that one, but so I don't know the extent to which some in the academic field are reluctant to speak about it in the media, at least.
Wow. On that positive note, let's move on to the international arena. So Julie, can you give us a high-level overview of the state of international governance of solar geoengineering as it relates to deployments and field experiments?
Sure, I'll try and answer that briefly. Yeah, so essentially at the international level, there's only a very limited number of legal frameworks that specifically talk about SRM or solar geoengineering, specifically address it in terms of its governance. But what is important to realize is that many existing laws at the international level are generally relevant and most likely applicable to SRM. It's important to realize that it's not an ungoverned area or ungovernable from that perspective. So think of laws related to human rights, pollution regulation, chemicals regulation, environmental impact assessment, protection of the marine environment, Arctic governance, etc. There's a bunch of or there's a broad range of legal frameworks in place that would govern any type of SRM activity, whether it's research or deployment. And the actual rules or the actual implications from a legal perspective very much depend on the type and the scale and the location of where that activity might take place. There are some non-binding legal initiatives. One from 2010, so under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. So when talking about moratoria, this was a decision which encouraged or called for all states party to the convention to refrain from geoengineering until certain conditions are met. So this is sometimes referred to as a de facto moratorium on geoengineering, but it's essentially qualified in the sense that if certain conditions are met, so if there's a scientific justification and there's a robust consideration of risks associated to the environment or biodiversity, as well as broader implications, social, economic, cultural impacts are considered. So that's what the moratorium relates to, and it makes an exception for small scale scientific research. So there's that distinction there between deployment and then small scale research. So that decision dates back from 2010, but it was recently reiterated at the last COP in November 24.
So is it fair to say we've got some general high-level principles that apply to everything, a few specific things that apply to SRM, but they've got lots of exceptions. Am I right that the CBD, the US isn't a signatory to the CBD?
They are a signatory, they haven't ratified it. So signing it is essentially saying we intend to be bound by the convention, but it's not actually legally binding, or the US is not legally bound by the UN CBD. I do believe they do participate in a lot of the activities, so they do have an involvement there.
Well, I wanted to go to Josh now, because we've been using the word ban and a slightly more obscure word, moratorium. So what's the difference between a ban and a moratorium?
Very important to differentiate these two things. So up until now, certainly the first part of the discussion here, we talked about bans in the US. A ban is simply a law or a decree or a statement that prohibits something, whether it's a technology or a practice or an activity, permanently, forever, or indefinitely, either because people regard that as morally objectionable, whatever it is. For example, there's a ban on human cloning, and or because they regard the risks of that activity as just too high, as unacceptable. Some countries have bans on GMOs, for example, for that very reason. A moratorium is similar, but not quite the same, because it does prohibit something, whether it's technology, an activity, a practice, but on a temporary basis. And usually what motivates moratoria are either concerns about the need to sort of pause and learn more about the activities in questions and sort of learn more about risks and try to assess the degree to which risks are serious or can be mitigated, and or the purpose is to reduce tensions among stakeholders surrounding a new technology or a new practice to try to facilitate bargains and agreements. Some combination of those things. RDNA in the 1970s was an example of a moratorium that was adopted temporarily. What moratoria have that bans don't have are conditions for lifting. That can be either very loose or very tight. But they specify either a duration after which the moratorium would be lifted, or conditions like sufficient scientific evidence justifying a practice, or sufficient governance that addresses risks sufficiently. Probably also worth mentioning that sometimes the difference between a moratorium and a ban can get a little muddled, because some moratoria, the conditions for lifting them can be so demanding, so onerous, or so vague that it can begin to resemble a de facto ban. Something that I think is an example of that would be the ban on commercial whaling, which isn't really a ban. It's a moratorium on commercial whaling, but it's been around for decades now. It seems immovable. It's regarded as a ban, so it's sort of a de facto ban by virtue of how difficult it is to undo it.
So just on that, I mean, if I'm a headline writer and I don't want to use the word moratorium, I've seen people substitute in ban for moratorium. Would pause be a better alternative? Or is there another term that can fit here?
Well, there aren't a lot of, I mean, pause is one possibility. I think, moratorium is the classic legalistic way to describe it, but it's also a little clunky. Pause is maybe a bit too informal, because you can pause all kinds of things and it's such a general term. But in a sense, the idea behind a moratorium is, let's pause this, let's wait and see, let's either learn more or talk amongst ourselves to figure out whether we should proceed, and if so, how. But pause for now.
So we've talked a bit about these movements in the US states and the state of current international governance. I want to turn now to, there's been an academic campaign, which is connected, an academic and political campaign for a so-called non-use agreement. What are they calling for? And can you give us a little bit of more information about what this effort is?
Well, I'll do my best to do it justice. The non-use agreement, sometimes called the NUA, is a proposal that was put forward by, I think, several hundred academics in the end, in 2022. And this proposal calls on states to prohibit a number of things. And they have sort of 5 items that they would like to see states prohibit. One would be public state funding for research on SRM, solar geoengineering. One would be prohibition on outdoor experiments of any scale outside the laboratory door. Third would be a prohibition on patent rights, or IP, trying to prevent people from taking out intellectual property on SRM technology. Fourth would be a ban on deployment, or let me say a prohibition on deployment, which is maybe the core of the non-use agreement. We don't want to see countries or actors under your jurisdiction deploying SRM, period. And then fifth and final, and maybe a little most squirrely, is a call to prohibit the institutionalization of SRM as a policy option within different kinds of bodies and governmental organizations considering how to proceed with climate. So it's sort of this call on countries to stop SRM from becoming normalized as one additional option in the climate policy portfolio. So that's my sort of summary of what it calls for and what its purpose is.
What effect has this had on the, because there's quite a lot of, that sounds like quite a lot of academics. What effect has this had beyond that some academics have signed it?
It's had real effects. It's, I think it's become a very sort of a concrete reference point in governance discussions about what to do with SRM, how to govern it, not just amongst academics and researchers, but amongst governments in a handful of intergovernmental bodies. It's become sort of something that's gained some support from some European states and some African states. No one has actually endorsed it or adopted it as the law of the land, but it's certainly gathered some rapport, and it's sort of driven a lot of the discussions. It's kind of become a fixture in intergovernmental debates about what to do about geoengineering. And again, no one's adopted it, but it certainly is very influential.
Yeah, I think, well, let's just turn to one place where that influence might have been felt. So, Julie, the European Commission recently received a set of recommendations from their chief scientific advisors, including a call for an EU-wide moratorium on the use of SRM as a measure for offsetting climate warming, as well as to block global deployment in the for the foreseeable future. Can you give us a quick sense of that call, and are these kind of recommendations generally followed?
Yeah, sure. So these recommendations were produced in November 24 as scientific opinion, and they were essentially requested by the College of Commissioners of so essentially the administration under Ursula von der Leyen. So it's a group of advisors. It's an institution under the scientific advice mechanism. So they bridge the science policy interface at the European level and provide scientific advice to policy and lawmakers, predominantly at the European Commission. The Commission or lawmakers at the EU level are not necessarily bound to follow that advice. It's really representing the scientific side. It's a scientific opinion. So whether lawmakers then actually decide to follow that or not is within their discretion, and will have to be balanced with societal values, political agendas, priorities, etc. So we don't know if the Commission will necessarily adopt these recommendations. There hasn't been any formal communication from the Commission since these reports came out. I imagine they're currently reviewing how to respond to that. But what we do see is that the EU has closely followed the advice from the scientific advice mechanism in other areas before. So it has sometimes adopted the specific advice, for example, clean energy or biodegradable products and other policy areas. So it's really the scientific opinion to inform policy making at the EU level.
And am I right? This is, they're speaking about prohibiting the use or a moratorium on the use, but they do allow for research. So what kind of impact would this have?
Yeah, so the moratorium that they're essentially recommending is on the use of SRM. So there's a clear distinction between use or the deployment of SRM and researching it. So the recommendation to adopt a moratorium is balanced by another recommendation, which essentially acknowledges that there's a need for and the wording is something like deepening our understanding of SRM as a technology. So in that sense, it's taking the current position that we don't have the knowledge or sufficient scientific basis to justify the use of SRM, but there's a further recommendation to deepen our understanding and so to essentially do more research.
And that just to clarify, that includes support for public funding for this research, as well as allowing outdoor field experiments. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the wording is quite. My reading of it is quite closely aligned to essentially what you see at the international level as well. So there's an exception for small scale scientific research, and then you can ask her what is small scale, but essentially it's general terminology that is used, so it would need to be kind of a case-by-case assessment, taking into consideration different environmental impacts, but essentially yeah, small enough to limit any transboundary impacts as best as possible, but kind of useful enough to gain a better understanding of the limits and potential of SRM. And the recommendations, they essentially contain some certain conditions. So we would need to any research would need to comply with ethical principle or considerations of justice impacts, etc. So it's essentially allowing for research, but for it to take place in a robust governance framework under certain conditions and controls, essentially.
Oh, thank you. Let's move over now to some questions from the audience.
Great. So the first question is from Peter Fromhoff. Are there reasons to believe that the governance challenges of establishing and maintaining effective moratoria or bans are lesser than those for deployment? Great question, Peter.
Maybe I'll put that to Josh first, unless anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, that's actually, I need to think about that. That's a really good question. Julie, if you have thoughts on that, feel free to jump in while I cogitate for a moment about the question.
Yeah, so I think it's a really difficult one to answer. It's anticipating how different governments might respond or might take a position on SRM and or a moratorium or a ban on SRM. I think there's risks associated with deployment that we know, but there's also risks with placing a ban on SRM or on SRM research. So I think for any policymaker, you would need to think about it. In the context of SRM, we often talk about the risk framework. So what is the alternative of, if we don't research or don't deploy SRM, what is then the risk of disastrous, catastrophic climate change? So I think it's in that context that we need to consider what the implications might be, and that's a difficult assessment to make. I don't think we have enough information at the moment to know how that would pan out in terms of governance challenges and enforcing either or governing a moratoria on one hand, or governing deployment in that sense.
Josh, have your cogitations completed?
They have, and I don't have a precise answer. I think it's very difficult to say, for me at least, to say which of those two pathways would be easier or tougher. What I will say, and sort of related to that, is that, and focusing more on moratoria, is that one of the ideas motivating some considerations of moratoria is the notion that you could pause, to use that from earlier, and reassure those actors, some actors at least, who are deeply concerned about notions about the slippery slope or about sort of inevitability being built into research, by formally sort of pledging yourselves or your country or your those who are within your country not to proceed past a certain point. And the idea is that this would sort of create a safe space in which research could proceed, but not too far and under certain kinds of constraints. That's one motivating sort of idea behind it, but there is a risk there that people bring up as well, which is the risk that any kind of moratorium, since it sort of equates in people's minds with a stop sign, will have a chilling effect on any kind of research, even if the intent of some promoting it is to sort of create that safe space. The result may be just to shut down research or to frighten people who might otherwise want to get involved. So it's not clear which way the risks run. I think it's a very difficult question, but again, it's risky both to adopt one and not to adopt one, and very much like we think about SRM in general as risky to do it, risky not to do it. So it echoes in this circumstance as well.
Excellent, thanks. Kerry, what's our next question?
Just going to pass over quickly to Craig, who had a point to add.
Oh, please.
Yes, I think one way of addressing this is thinking practically. So, having run a large climate and air agency, one thing that strikes me about some of the academic points, including from the non-use folks, is it is a bit academic in that, in practice, deployment at a scale that would meaningfully alter global temperature for a long time. You're talking thousands of flights, in a sort of a massive aviation effort under current technology. That's not a subtle thing, nor is it a thing that you need hypersensitive detection for, unlike, say, small-scale experiments. That really strongly suggests to me that then enforcing a true moratorium on a truly global deployment, in fact, would be a matter of great state geopolitics, and rather than anything else. And that becomes a debate over how the states with those resources, which is really a small number of states, behave. And that's quite different than asking for no research at all to understand the technology. So I think one thing that it has helped me think about this is the sort of state capacity required to deploy at scale is meaningfully different than the capacity needed to do small-scale experiments, but so is the scale of potential effect, which really suggests a sort of step-by-step approach to this, in which one could understand effects actually quite sensibly at relatively low risk. And one could be fairly sure that no great power would dedicate state capacity to deployment without quite a lot of research. So just to add, as someone who's actually done implementation quite a lot, I think that sometimes the abstract notion that it can be very hard to devise a perfect governance agreement gets in the way of thinking practically about how one could learn.
Thanks, Craig. That's great. And our next question is from Janos Pastor. What do you think of the bottom-up, step-by-step voluntary moratorium proposed by the Overshoot Commission? Could this be useful or achievable? Who wants to dive in on that one?
I feel somewhat obligated to. I helped craft that recommendation in the report. I think it's one workable approach. There's this idea that many of us have, or assumption that big prohibitions, big international laws are arrived at centrally, top down, at big conferences with the UN involved, and countries agree on something and they implement what they agree to, and it sort of disperses from there. With regards to a lot of sort of SRM proposals, I think there's a recognition that the days of that kind of international lawmaking may be behind us for now, and it may be more constructive to either sort of adopt a purely sort of bottom-up approach, which may not even involve states initially, or a sort of a coalition club approach, which can involve those states or other actors, or both, that are committed to certain causes to be able to get beyond the obstacles posed by, say, the UN consensus expectations, and push forward ideas like a moratorium on SRM, on large-scale interventions. I think what motivates that recommendation is the recognition that other pathways that we maybe are used to thinking about are less viable in this day and age, and not just current geopolitics, but the past 20, 30 years. So I think that's one approach. I think one problem with that approach is that how do you make sure that individual countries or actors adopting a moratorium are adopting the same text or language or same substance? It could be pretty easily conceived where you have a bunch of sloppy combinations of moratoria or de facto bans that are kind of similar but kind of not, and create even more confusion for a lot of actors who would consider going and doing research. So the bottom-up approach does have that risk entailed.
Hi. So I think we've got a couple more questions. I just wanted to do, mindful of the time, a kind of a quick wrap up where we're just going to ask you a quick question via a poll to the audience members. And also, basically, I'd love to make an appeal. If you have any more questions, people in the audience, please do get in touch with us and we'll do our best to answer, or to send you to people who can answer. And similarly, for any media members in the audience, please feel free to get in touch. We're very happy to help you, connect you with experts, provide you, with what materials we can. So we have a quick question here, I think should have popped up for everybody. And if you could just add in any topics that you think that we should be covering in future events. We see this as the first in a Making Sense Of series. We've got a lot of ideas moving forwards, but we very much want to be responsive to what people suggest. So if you could answer that, we'll get all of that. We will at the end of, once this is over, this briefing will go through all of that, work out what we can do. We're going to be sending a post-briefing email to everybody, including a link to the video of this event. So that's fantastic. And then I think what we're going to do is we'll basically say this is sort of the end, but we can go for another 10 minutes or so with some of the questions left over. So yeah, thanks again. We're pretty excited. We had 80 participants, which we're pretty excited has been a fantastic response to this first thing. It's such a fascinating moment in this field. And a lot of people are still trying to work out how to navigate this fast shifting environment. So
if I could just jump in briefly there, Mark. I mean, I think maybe for those who aren't familiar with us, our scope is quite broad. Obviously, we focused on governance aspects of these ideas here, but there's no wrong answer for things you might want to see. So we'll cover science, tipping points, any engineering things, whatever it is you might be interested in. Please do let us know. This is a very broad topic and a tricky one. So we'd love to feature experts from across the board and see your answers, see your questions to them answered. So yeah, be creative.
Fantastic. And by the way, when I think when we finally close the event, there will be a sort of a post-event questionnaire pop up just rating us, and we'll send that separately. We'll send that separately. So maybe if we could just move on to the last couple of questions. Here's one that grabbed me, and perhaps Joe, given your experience of speaking to people in Kentucky, in your view, who might be trusted, if anyone, by conspiracy theorists, chemtrailers, who could speak to them and help, debunk claims about geoengineering? What thoughts do you have on that? It's the mysterious trust question. Where can that trust come from?
Well, I would be skeptical of anyone having that power whose name wasn't Donald Trump, and I don't think he's going to be doing that, or RFK Jr. And he's on the flip side of that. So I don't even know who that would even conceivably be.
Can I suggest? Sorry, just I mean, I guess there's quite a lot of very, very popular conspiracy adjacent podcasts out there. The Joe Rogans of the world. How much of an influence do they have? Are they kind of peripheral to that, or do you think they could have some influence on these kind of discussions?
Oh, I think they absolutely could have an influence, considering the millions of people in their audience. Someone like Joe Rogan. I don't think Joe Rogan's gonna be debunking many conspiracy theories, and certainly not this one. And of course, RFK Jr. devoted an entire episode of his podcast to what he called the chemtrails question, and invited on someone spreading pretty clearly misinformation about it, saying that virtually all commercial flights are equipped with chemtrail sprayers. So I'm not sure who would be the source, the media source who those people listen to, who would be someone to aggressively combat whether geoengineering is currently underway and the government is keeping it from you covertly.
Thank you. Josh, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, just very quickly, I follow up. In my experience, it's not so much about who these folks are talking to as it is about the way they're being spoken to and listened to. I think what motivates a lot of folks who are deeply concerned about things like chemtrails or other kinds of things that we may call conspiracy theories is typically sort of close to home, concerns about public health, about pollutants, about their families. And we may think that the concerns are overblown or totally misplaced, but that's usually what's motivating the concerns, which is entirely understandable. So in my experience, the way to sort of approach and try to find a middle ground is to listen and try to understand those concerns before just preaching and sort of castigating and lecturing. If you can sort of listen and try to meet them halfway, I think that goes a long way towards lowering the temperature often and allowing for a more constructive conversation that usually ends in debunking or at least taking away some of the sting from these concerns regarding conspiracy, what we would call conspiracies.
Great. Kerry, do you want to take us through the last couple of questions? I think we
Yeah.
have flexibility for a couple more minutes for those who want to hang on. And otherwise, thank you so much to everybody who attended. We really appreciate your time.
Yes, we have a question from Chris Leonard. Given that the global north is beginning to feel the impacts of climate change more and more, and the impacts are beginning to impact significantly economically, do you think SRM will become more acceptable in the greater global north discourse on how to mitigate climate change impacts? Craig.
Not only more acceptable, but likely. I think one of the reasons these bills are so concerning is that both the costs of deployment and its likely harms are very substantially less, as far as I can tell, than, say, a 4°C world. And that's likely to mean that global north governments and global south governments are likely to need to understand the technology. So to my mind, to get to the earlier question, I don't know that's about convincing chemtrailers this is different right now. That's a hard problem. The easier, or at least more important problem is helping everyone else, especially at the center, understand that this needs to be understood properly. Because really one of the worst cases is we get ad hoc deployment by a great power in a decade when people don't properly understand this and haven't thought through governance. So when I look down the lines with the President of the United States promoting coal power, of all things, I see a really clear need for the sorts of folks on this webinar to think really seriously about this. We're well past a position where we can assume this won't come up.
Thanks, Craig. Did anyone want to add to that? Okay,
I actually
moving on.
like to hear Julie, if you're still there, because I'm wondering how that sounds from a European perspective, because often US and European commentators and researchers vary a bit in terms of their perspective on the acceptability or the appropriateness of considering SRM. So if you're here still, I'd love to hear your sort of take on what Craig just said.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I find it difficult to really comment on sort of the public perception and things like that, and how that would be different in the sort of European continent and the US. I think the conspiracy that movement seems to be visible in the US, but I don't think it's unique to the US. I think that goes across other continents and global north as well. But in terms of the climate impacts being felt in more and more regions, I think it's an indicate, or it's certainly a reason to be looking at all types of interventions that might be necessary, and one of which is SRM. So I think it is more likely that as climate change is being felt more and more, it opens up room for a debate around, is SRM, sorry, a viable option, and can it ever be acceptable in the balance of risking or balancing that against risks of climate change. So as we are feeling more of the impacts of climate change, I think there will be a shift towards also acknowledge or considering possibilities of SRM more and more.
Thanks, Julie. And thanks so much to all our speakers for hanging on for these extra questions. There was one about misinformation that quite a few viewers were keen to see answered. We touched a little bit on trust, But Nick asks, are there any large-scale efforts underway to bring more direct and accessible scientific communication into the space, rather than relying on academic papers to be picked up by media outlets selectively? Joe, can I pass to you? Or anyone want to dive in on that?
I would say it would have been much easier. It's much easier for journalists to cover the issue if there are groups who are, open to answering questions and giving feedback and giving information so that they can report a story. And it's not just because there's always the question of you don't want to get into the both sides issue if one side is completely spreading misinformation. So you want to have an informative, informed voice that you're letting speak on an issue. So that would make journalists' job a lot easier if there were groups out there that were informing people, and so the media could cite them and speak to them.
If only there was an organization supporting an informed discussion of solar geoengineering out there. Well, you might find one on srm360.org, but I was wondering if that's a little leading, Carrie.
Completely unintentional. I did not write these questions, but thanks very much, Nick. That's super. And I might combine a couple of questions that have cropped up on monitoring. So Matthias asks, how could a global norm prevent uncoordinated deployment without a joint monitoring effort? And Cynthia says, what are the odds that a global superpower would accept the findings of an international monitoring mechanism? Who would like to pick that up? International monitoring.
I can jump in. Yeah, I think this is a real challenge. I think SRM, in a way, is unique in the sense that we are very much being challenged, to think about this international governance question. I don't think we've had that situation before necessarily, where a technology requires this level of international governance, other than perhaps sort of Cold War balance of powers and nuclear weapons in that sense. But in terms of effectively deploying a technology such as stratospheric aerosol injection requires some degree of global governance for it to even be effective. So I don't think we've had to collaborate on that level at the international level before, really. So I think it is a significant challenge that will need to be considered. In terms of global norms, yes, I think in international collaboration, transparency, those sorts of norms are kind of being discussed and raised in different reports. It's just whether different parties can be convinced by those norms and the importance of following and implementing those norms, I would think.
Yeah, it might be worth noting here, there are quite established international organizations for collaborations on various aspects of science, the World Meteorological Organization, for example. So I think there wouldn't necessarily need to be things built from scratch, but a strengthening of existing relationships, taking on new responsibilities, building it into scientific networks. There's ways that some of this could be got at in a more informal manner, or not through the UN organizations.
Then the last question for today I'm going to select is, how long does it take to design and implement a moratorium or ban of a technology or practice at the global level? So thinking about broad time spans, who'd like to answer that?
You want to go, Josh?
I'm not sure there's a single answer to that. I mean, I think so much depends upon the technology you're talking about, the sort of geopolitical context, the technological context. If the question is how quickly could the international community agree on, say, a moratorium on geoengineering, well, nobody knows, but I think in theory at least, if one pursued that in a sort of more bottom-up, more sort of country or actor-driven way, as opposed to a top-down UN COP kind of way, and you didn't try to bind countries, but settled for countries sort of pledging themselves to not to exceed experiments past a certain threshold, or whatever the condition is. It could be done very quickly, depending on which countries you're talking to, how many, and the nature of what you're asking to do. I mean, in principle, you could do this in 5 years, but in practice, things take longer. So it'd be crazy for me to predict how long it would take. But it's certainly, the less formal, the less restrictive, and the less top-down the approach is, the quicker one or countries could achieve something like that, I think.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to Julie, Craig, Joe, Josh for taking part in this, and thank you so much to everybody. I still see we still have half our participants, so it's encouraging. You've obviously said some interesting things. Again, just an appeal, please get in touch with us if you have any further questions, want any further engagement, and follow us on social media, and sign up for our newsletter. We're on LinkedIn, X, we're on Blue Sky, and our social media, and our newsletters. We basically have a monthly overview, and then we also, if you want to sign up for the more kind of technical, just everything that happened weekly, we also have one of those. We're going to be doing a website refresh shortly, so watch this space and look forward to being in touch. So thank you, everyone. I don't know if everybody wants to say a little bye-bye or
Bye.
Thanks
Yeah.
for
Thanks all.
hosting.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having us.
Thanks much.
Thank you all.
Bye all.
Thank you.